There is a rule about trees that almost nobody says out loud, and once you hear it you will start checking it everywhere you go. No living tree on this planet is older than about 5,000 years. Not one. You can walk any forest on any continent. You can climb into the oldest groves that scientists have ever measured, and the number stops in the same place. 4,000 something. A little under 5,000. And then nothing. The living record of wood simply refuses to go back any further than that, as if something happened and the counting had to start again from zero. Now the ordinary answer to this is that trees die. They burn, they rot, they get struck by lightning, they fall in storms, and the longer any single tree stands, the more chances it has to be killed by something. That is true. And we are going to take that answer seriously, because it is the honest one. But hold on to the strangeness for a moment before we explain it away. Because when you lay the tree record next to the human record, next to the moment writing appears, I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Next to the moment the first cities rise, next to the moment half a dozen unrelated calendars all decide that time itself begins, they land on the same shelf. Roughly 5,000 years ago. And nobody who tells you the tree story and nobody who tells you the city story ever seems to put those two facts in the same sentence. Let us start with the oldest of them, the tree everyone has heard about. High in the White Mountains of eastern California, in a cold, dry basin above 10,000 feet, there is a bristlecone pine called Methuselah. It has been dated by counting and cross-checking its rings to somewhere around 4,850 years old. That means it was already a seedling when the pyramids at Giza were being cut and stacked. It was alive through the entire recorded history of every empire you can name. And here is the first quiet detail worth noticing. The United States Forest Service will not tell you which tree it is. Its exact location is kept secret. There is no plaque, no trail marker, no photograph officially confirmed, because when people found out which tree it was, some of them wanted a piece of it. So the oldest known living thing on Earth stands in a grove of thousands of similar trees, unlabeled, protected by anonymity. You could be standing next to it and never know. And that secrecy exists for a reason, because we already destroyed the older one. In the summer of 1964, a graduate student named Donald Curry was studying Ice Age climate in Nevada in a grove of bristlecones on Wheeler Peak. He was taking core samples with a tool called an increment borer, a long hollow bit you twist into the trunk to pull out a thin straw of wood so you can count the rings without killing the tree. The story that has come down to us, and there are competing versions of it, is that his borer broke, or was too short to reach the center of one particular ancient tree. He needed the full count. So a request went up the chain, and the Forest Service gave permission, and that tree was cut down. When they counted the rings on the stump, the number came back at over 4,800, and by some later corrected counts it may have been closer to 5,000. The tree, which was later given the name Prometheus, was in all likelihood the oldest individual living organism that had ever been found. And it had just been felled with a chainsaw by the very people who were supposed to be studying it. There was no malice in it. It was a permit, a broken tool, a routine decision. That is how the oldest living thing on Earth ended, not in a storm, but in paperwork. The site is now inside Great Basin National Park, established in 1986, partly in the long shadow of what happened there. Sit with that, because it tells you something about how the sealing gets enforced. The reason we know these trees are so old at all is a science barely 100 years old, and it was invented almost by accident by a man who was not even looking for trees. He was looking at the sun. His name was Andrew Ellicott Douglas, an astronomer working in Arizona in the early 1900s. He was obsessed with sunspots, with the idea that the sun runs on cycles that might affect climate on Earth. He needed a long climate record to test that idea, longer than any weather station could give him, and he realized that trees kept one. In a place with wet years and dry years, a tree grows a fat ring in a good year and a thin, starved ring in a bad one. Line up enough trees, and the pattern of fat and thin rings becomes a fingerprint, a barcode of good and bad seasons that every tree in the region shares. That was the breakthrough. Douglas realized that if a living tree and a dead beam from an old building shared the same barcode in their overlapping years, you could chain them together. The living tree gives you the recent centuries. The old beam, dead for hundreds of years, overlaps at one end and reaches further back. Find an even older beam that overlaps that one, and you march backward in time, tree by tree, beam by beam. He called it cross-dating, and in 1929, working with a charred beam from a ruin at Show Low, Arizona, a specimen catalogued as HH39, he closed the last gap in a floating chronology of the American Southwest and gave the ancient pueblos real calendar dates for the first time. In 1937, he founded the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research, which still runs today. An entire way of reading time was born from a man trying to understand the weather. And this is where the economics quietly enters, because a way of reading time is also a way of settling arguments about the past, and whoever controls the settling controls a great deal. Think about what a firm calendar date is actually worth. It decides which civilization gets called the first. It decides whose artifact is authentic and whose is a fake. It decides which painting is a genuine old master and which is a clever forgery, which shipwreck is which treaty predates which claim. A confirmed date is money, and the tree ring chain is the thing that confirms it. The laboratories that hold the master chronologies are not neutral vaults. They are the places the arguments get settled, and they were built and funded by universities and governments and, further back, by the same interests that wanted to date their own monuments and their own ruins first. We will come back to that, but hold the idea. The clock is not just wood, it is authority. Dendrochronology, the tree ring method, has a hard flaw built into it. It can only reach as far back as you can find overlapping wood. In the American Southwest, that chain runs a couple of thousand years. In Europe, scientists went hunting for something better, and they found it in the riverbeds of Germany. Oaks that fell into rivers thousands of years ago, buried in gravel and mud, waterlogged and preserved, can be pulled out and their rings matched to each other. At Hohenheim, German researchers assembled a chain of subfossil oak and pine that stretches back more than 12,000 years, past the end of the last ice age. It is one of the great patient achievements of science, a calendar built from dead logs, one overlap at a time. But notice what that is. It is a chain of dead wood. Not one of those Hohenheim oaks is alive. The moment you want a living tree, the chain snaps at around 5,000 years, and no farther. The dead can testify to 12,000 years. The living stop at 5. Now the tree ring calendar turned out to be worth far more than dating old buildings, and here is why. When radiocarbon dating was invented by Willard Libby in the late 1940s, it promised to date anything organic anywhere, but it had a flaw. It assumed the amount of radioactive carbon in the atmosphere was constant through history, and it is not. It wobbles. So a raw radiocarbon date can be off by centuries. What fixed it was the trees. Because a tree ring can be both radiocarbon dated and calendar dated by counting, scientists could compare the two and build a correction curve. That curve is called IntCal, and it is rebuilt and refined every few years. Almost every radiocarbon date you have ever read, every mummy, every shroud, every ancient seed, was silently corrected against a curve made of counted tree rings. The trees are the master clock that the rest of archaeology is set against, and the trees hide something inside them that makes this even sharper. In the early 2010s, a Japanese researcher named Fusa Miyake found that in the year 774 and 775, tree rings all over the world show a sudden spike in radiocarbon, a jolt far too big and too fast to be normal. The best explanation is an enormous burst of radiation from the sun, a solar storm larger than anything in modern records. There is another spike in 993. These are now called Miyake events, and they are like timestamps burned into the wood of the entire planet in the same year. If a solar flare that violent hit today, it would fry satellites and grids across the world. The trees remember it. They wrote it down. And because they wrote it down, those spikes have become a tool for pinning down history to the single year. When archaeologists find a wooden structure, and it happens to contain the 774 jolt in one of its rings, They can count outward from that ring and date the whole thing to an exactness that written chronicles almost never allow. Viking settlements, medieval churches, ancient shipwrecks, all of them can now be locked to a calendar year if the right ring is present. This is called wiggle matching, sliding a piece of dead wood along the master curve until its pattern of radiocarbon rises and falls, clicks into place. It sounds like pure science, and it is, but notice again what sits underneath it. Everything depends on the master curve being right, and the master curve is a human construction, assembled, revised, and occasionally redated as new wood comes in. Change the curve, and you change the age of half the ancient world at a stroke. The people who maintain that curve hold a quiet kind of power that almost nobody outside the field even knows exists. So, the wood is an extraordinarily precise instrument, which makes the ceiling all the more curious, because the instrument keeps returning the same reading. Let us do the roll call. The giant sequoias of California, the most massive trees on Earth by volume, run up to around 3,200 years for the oldest confirmed individuals. The coast redwoods, the tallest, reach a couple of thousand and possibly more, though the oldest are hard to core. In the mountains of Chile there is an alerce, a South American cypress, nicknamed the great-grandfather, gran abuelo, which a partial core and a statistical model suggest could be over 5,000 years old, and if that estimate holds it would break the ceiling. But it is contested, precisely because it was not counted ring by ring to the centre, and the moment a claim crosses 5,000 the scrutiny becomes intense. In Wales the Llangannu yew and in Scotland the Fortingall yew are spoken of as 3,000, 4,000, even 5,000 years old, but yews rot hollow from the inside as they age, which destroys the very rings you would need to count, so their ages are estimates wrapped in folklore. In Iran the great cypress of Abarca, Savi Abarca, is said to be around 4,000 years old. On a Japanese island the Jomonsugi cedar is dated between 2,000 and possibly much more. In Africa the ancient baobabs were thought to be near immortal, until something disturbing happened in the last decade. Between 2005 and 2017, 9 of the 13 oldest known baobabs, some over 2,000 years old, abruptly died. Trees that had stood since before Rome, gone in a handful of years, and researchers are still arguing about why. Do you see the shape of it? From every continent, from completely unrelated species that could not have coordinated anything, the oldest individuals cluster below one line and press up against it and almost never cross it. Different trees, different climates, different hemispheres, same ceiling. And look at where the survivors actually stand, because it is not random. The bristlecones that live longest do not grow in the good soil down in the valley. They grow on exposed dolomite, a chalky white rock, so poor in nutrients that almost nothing else will take root there. The trees grow agonizingly slowly. An inch of trunk width can take a century, and that slow dense wood resists rot and insects and fire, because fire needs fuel and on a bare dolomite ridge there is nothing to burn. The oldest wood on earth survived by choosing the worst possible address. Down in the fertile ground where trees grow fast and tall and strong, nothing ancient is left standing at all, which tells you the ceiling is not really about how long a tree can live. It is about where a tree is allowed to live long, and that is a much smaller and stranger set of places than the whole surface of the planet. Now here is the objection you should be raising, and it is a good one, so let us give it real weight. Trees can cheat death by cloning. This is the honest complication in the whole story. In Sweden there is a spruce called Old Chico whose visible trunk is only a few hundred years old, but whose root system has been radiocarbon dated to around 9,500 years. The tree keeps sending up new trunks from the same ancient roots. In Utah there is Pando, an aspen grove that is genetically a single organism, one root system sending up 40,000 trunks across 100 acres, possibly tens of thousands of years old as a system. There is a patch of seagrass in the Mediterranean estimated at 100,000 years. There is a Tasmanian shrub called Kinglomatia, king's holly, that may be 43,000 years old as a clone. So life can persist far past 5,000 years. But look closely at what all of those are. They are root systems, colonies, clones. Not one of them is a single continuous trunk you could cut and count. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now. because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. The individual, the actual standing pillar of wood with an unbroken ring for every year of its life, still stops at 5,000. The roots may whisper of a much older world. But the standing trees, the ones that would have watched, the ones that could have kept a continuous ring-by-ring diary of everything that happened, none of them go back past that wall. And this is where you have to at least ask the question the tree scientists never ask, because it is not their job. Why 5,000? Because something else on this planet also starts almost exactly there. Look at when human civilization, as the textbooks define it, switches on. Writing appears in Sumer around 3,200 years before the Common Era. Dynastic Egypt unifies around 3,100. The cities of the Indus Valley rise in the same window. In South America, the monumental site of Norte Chico is built in the same centuries. Stonehenge takes its great stone form around then. In China, the traditional start of the Xia dynasty falls in the same range. Now stack the calendars people actually built to count time. The Maya long count sets its 0 point at a date that converts to August, 3114 before the Common Era. In Hindu tradition, the current age, the Kali Yuga, is calculated to begin in 3102. The Hebrew calendar counts from a creation date that lands at 3761. The Byzantine world reckoned from a similar point. Look at those numbers together: 3200, 3100, 3114, 3102, 3761. Cultures on opposite sides of the planet, with no contact, no shared language, no way to copy each other, all drew a line in the sand at roughly the same moment and said, "Before this, we do not count. Time starts here." And a bristlecone pine in California, and an alerce in Chile, and a cypress in Iran all independently agree that the oldest wood still breathing was planted in that same narrow band of years. The mainstream historian will tell you this is not mysterious at all. Civilization needed agriculture, agriculture needed a stable climate, and the climate did stabilize after the last ice age. The great melt ended, sea levels leveled off, and only then could permanent cities and long-lived groves both take hold. That is a serious answer, and we should not wave it away. There is even a specific climate event in the middle of the record, around 4,200 years ago, a global drought and cooling now called the 4.2 kiloyear event, associated with the collapse of the Akkadian Empire and the drying of the Sahara from green grassland into desert. Real trees would have died in that. Real cities did fall. So the clustering may simply be the fingerprint of a planet settling into the climate we still live in. There is more to that honest case, and it deserves saying in full. When the last ice age ended, the great continental ice sheets melted and the sea rose fast, hundreds of feet over a few thousand years, drowning coastlines the whole world over. Around 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, that rise finally slowed, and the shorelines steadied near where they sit today. Coastal marshes stabilized, river deltas stopped shifting, and the flat, fertile ground where the first great cities were built only became reliably habitable once the water stopped moving. In that reading, cities and long-lived groves both appear at roughly the same time for the same dull reason. The ground under them finally stopped changing. No mystery, no lost morning, just a planet exhaling after 10,000 violent years and holding still long enough for something permanent to take root. A careful person has to grant that this might explain everything on the board, the trees and the calendars and the cities all at once, with nothing left over. That is the honest counter, and it may well be the whole truth. But keep two things in your hand at once. The scientists explain the trees with survivorship. The oldest trees survive because they grow in the harshest, driest, most useless places, high on dolomite ridges where nothing competes with them and no fire can spread and no logger ever bothered to climb. A bristlecone survives 5,000 years by growing where success is impossible. That is a beautiful and probably correct explanation. And it quietly admits the deeper economic truth underneath this entire subject. Every tree that grew somewhere useful is already gone. We cut them. This is the part the tree romance leaves out, and it is the part that actually shaped the modern world. Old trees are not just old, they are timber. A tall, straight, ancient tree is the most valuable structural material a pre-industrial society could get its hands on, and empires were built, quite literally, on hunting them down. Consider the tallest, straightest pines of colonial New England. The British Royal Navy needed enormous single trunks for the masts of its warships, and it could not grow them at home anymore because Europe had already cut its own giants centuries before. So the Crown sent surveyors into the American forests to find the biggest white pines, and they marked each chosen tree by cutting 3 axe strokes into the bark in the shape of an arrow. The broad arrow. That mark made the tree property of the king, and it was a crime for any colonist to cut it, even on his own land. Men who had cleared that ground and needed the wood for their own homes and mills were told the best trees were reserved for a navy across the ocean. In 1772, in New Hampshire, colonists who had been fined for milling marked pines rioted, whipped the officials sent to punish them, and cut the ears and manes off their horses. It is called the Pine Tree Riot, and it happened before the more famous tea went into Boston Harbor. The revolution was partly a fight over who owned the oldest trees. Move forward. As the young United States expanded, its forests were treated as an inexhaustible mine. In 1900, the timber baron Frederick Weyerhaeuser bought roughly 900,000 acres of Pacific Northwest forest in a single transaction, one of the largest private land deals in American history, and the ancient trees on it were cut for lumber. The oldest living things in those valleys were converted into houses and railroad ties and newsprint, and the count on that land restarted at 0, replanted with young, fast-growing trees on a schedule, a crop, a rotation, a forest managed for the next quarter, not the next 1,000 years, and the old count on that ground was simply erased. And when a few people finally tried to save a stand of the giants, look at how it had to be done. In 1908, a congressman named William Kent bought a grove of ancient coast redwoods with his own money to stop a water company from flooding it, and donated it to the nation. It became Muir Woods. The only way to preserve the old trees was to take them out of the economy entirely, to make them legally unsellable, because as long as they had a price, the price would win. There is a stranger chapter still, in New Zealand. Under the swamps of the North Island lie the buried trunks of kauri trees, giants that fell and were entombed in peat tens of thousands of years ago. The bog preserved them so perfectly that the wood can be dug up and milled and sold as ancient timber, some of it radiocarbon dead, meaning it is older than the 50,000-year limit of the method itself. And there has been a running fight for years over exporting that swamp kauri, over who is allowed to pull these prehistoric logs out of the ground and ship them overseas as raw slabs. Even the trees that died before recorded history became a commodity the moment someone found a buyer. And the numbers on what was taken are staggering when you stop to look. Across most of Europe, the primeval forest was essentially gone by the Middle Ages, cut for ships and charcoal and farmland, which is exactly why the Royal Navy had to go hunting in America in the first place. In the United States, the vast majority of the original old growth was cut within a few generations of settlement reaching it until only a few % remained, mostly in parks and on ground too steep or too remote to log profitably. What we call ancient forest today is, almost everywhere, a small, protected remnant, a museum piece, surrounded by second and third growth planted on rotation like wheat. The world is not covered in old trees that happen to top out at 5,000 years. The world was stripped of its old trees, and the few oldest survivors cling to the exact places the loggers could not reach or did not want. The ceiling and the clear cut are the same fact told from 2 directions. There is even a market now in the wood itself as proof. Reclaimed ancient timber, verified old beams, cored and dated slabs, all of it carries a premium precisely because its age can be certified against those same tree ring chronologies. Authenticity has become the product. A plank is worth more if a laboratory will swear to its year, and the laboratory can only swear to it because the master chronology exists. So the same instrument that tells us no living tree passes 5,000 years is also the instrument that prices dead wood by the century. Age was turned into a number, and the number was turned into money, and the whole apparatus runs on a calendar made of rings. So put the 2 records back together now, the wood and the money, and the picture sharpens. The reason no living tree is older than 5,000 years may be that the climate reset 5,000 years ago. Or it may be, in every accessible forest on Earth, that we ourselves are the reset, that the ceiling is not natural at all in most places, but a receipt. The old growth is gone because it was worth too much to leave standing, and what remains at the edge of the ceiling survives only in the useless places, on the Dolomite Ridge, in the anonymous grove, behind the secret with no plaque. And here is the thought the revisionists hold on to, the one the textbooks will not touch. If you wanted to end a world and start the count over, you would not need to destroy everything. You would only need to break the record, burn the libraries, level the cities, and cut the trees, and the memory of what came before has nowhere left to live. A tree is the one witness that cannot be bribed or rewritten, because it records the years automatically, one ring at a time, whether anyone is watching or not. So the fact that no living tree carries a continuous diary from before 5,000 years ago is, in this reading, not an accident of climate at all. It is the erasure itself. The oldest surviving witness begins its testimony at exactly the moment the human record says the beginning was, because both the witness and the record were started fresh at the same point, by the same reset, whatever it was. That is the claim. I am not telling you it is true. The climate case is strong and the survivorship case is stronger. But you should at least know that the tidy scientific answer and the unsettling one both fit the same evidence, and the evidence is a line about 5,000 years back that nothing living has ever crossed. And then there is the last turn, the modern one, because the same economy that cut the old trees has now discovered a new way to price them. A living tree stores carbon, so a standing forest can now be sold, not as timber, but as a carbon offset, a certificate that lets someone somewhere else keep burning fuel because these trees are absorbing the difference. The oldest trees, the ones we spent 4 centuries hunting for their trunks, are suddenly worth money again for the exact opposite reason, for staying alive and staying whole. The bristlecone that survived 5,000 years by being worthless is being repriced right now as an asset. And the great question hanging over that market is whether the counting will be honest this time, or whether, as with every ledger before it, the number will end up wherever the buyer needs it to end. Here is what I keep coming back to. We have a clock made of wood, the most precise natural calendar we own, the instrument every other date is checked against. And that clock, when you ask it about living things, always returns the same answer. It restarts at the same point. The scientists have good reasons: climate, survivorship, erosion of the old pedestals, the 4.2 kiloyear drought. Every one of those reasons is probably true. And still, every unrelated tree, and every unrelated calendar, and the first writing, and the first cities, all agree on a line about 5,000 years back, and past that line the standing wood goes silent, and the human record calls it the beginning. Maybe those are 2 separate facts that only look like one. Maybe a settling climate really did open the door for old trees and old cities in the same century, and there is nothing more to it. That is the sober reading, and it may be correct. But the next time you stand under something ancient, a yew in a churchyard, a cedar on a mountain, a redwood in a protected grove, do the arithmetic in your head. Count back from the year it started. See where it lands. And notice that every old thing that is still alive, everywhere on this planet, seems to have started counting from the same lost morning, the one just before the written records of our entire world are ever allowed to begin. Then make of that what you will.